In the small hours of the 23rd of November 1939, a British naval and army working party launched one of the most hazardous secret missions of World War II. Its task was to neutralize a mysterious new German mine, which posed a potentially deadly threat to British merchant shipping. Within minutes of Britain's declaration of war on Germany, the German Navy began to lay mines in the North Sea. These were contact mines, moored to the seabed at varying depths. If a ship came into contact with them, the mines exploded. But the mystery mine had been dropped by parachute and was a so-called influence weapon, which didn't need contact with a ship to detonate. Throughout the war, the British depended on shipping lanes both to feed and to arm themselves. They won the struggle to keep the lanes open. In the Pacific, the Japanese faced the same stark problem. Their failure to defeat the menace of mines and enemy submarines doomed them to defeat. The British maintained the largest merchant fleet in the world, some 3,000 ocean-going vessels and 1,000 large coastal ships. At any one time, 2,500 ships were at sea. They presented a large target for U-boats and for mines. E-boats were adapted to lay mines in Britain's coastal waters, and U-boats stole in to seed harbours and estuaries. The mines quickly began to take their toll. Because they were laid in shallow waters, low tide revealed their sunken victims in a growing number of merchant shipping and Royal Navy graveyards. There was also a psychological price to be paid. Crews could never relax when there were mines about. An alarming pattern also began to develop. Some ships sustained severe damage from what appeared to be mine explosions, but they didn't sink. Their damaged hulls didn't reveal dramatic gashes. Rather, their steel plates had cracked like eggshells from deck to keel. The damage was severe and, for the moment, inexplicable. Items of machinery on the deck had been snapped apart by the force of the explosion. Rivets had been popped from the hull. Was a mine behind this? Mine sweeping and mine warfare were the job of a Royal Navy shore establishment, HMS Vernon in Portsmouth. At Vernon, concern grew over the sunken shipping in the Thames estuary. The experts deduced that the damage was being caused by a new kind of influence mine, perhaps activated by sound or water pressure. In itself, this was nothing new to the British. In the closing months of the First World War, they had conducted experiments with influence mines. But the armistice had arrived in November 1918, before the mines could be used operationally. Until a specimen of the new German mine could be obtained, it would pose a grave threat to British shipping. It could lose the British the war. The chiefs of the German Navy were eager to step up the mining campaign, using the Luftwaffe's Heinkel HE-111 bombers. But the Luftwaffe balked at releasing aircraft for these missions. The Navy resorted to seeding the new mines with cumbersome HE-59 float planes. The British began to trawl for them. They were now sure that the mines were designed to settle on the bottom. One of the trawlers, Mastiff, was blown up when it was hauling in what appeared to be an unknown mine. The sea seemed reluctant to give up its secrets. By mid-November 1939, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, had become thoroughly alarmed. He remained outwardly confident, but warned the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, that everything depended on the early recovery of one of the German-influenced mines. Churchill noted in a meeting with Pound and his staff that mines were now sinking more ships than the U-boats. The minesweeping service introduced a recruiting drive. Men were recalled from the merchant marine to fight the new menace. They joined the drifters of Mine Recovery Flotilla 3, which launched an offensive against moored contact mines, cutting their cables and then finishing them off with gunfire on the surface. From Falmouth in the West Country to the west coast of Scotland, the hunt continued for the German-influenced mine, which was causing so much damage to coastal shipping. One of them was brought up in a net off Budden Ness in Scotland, but once again exploded before it could be hauled aboard. Then on the night of the 22nd of December 1939, close to high water, an unidentified aircraft was heard off the seaside town of Shoebury Ness in the southeast of England. It was a calm night of almost full moon. The masters of merchant ships anchored in the Thames estuary had reported seeing a low-flying aircraft release a strange object. Witnesses described it as a big kit bag suspended from a parachute. Commander John Ouvry of HMS Vernon was called in.
I was sitting at the DMS, Director of Minesweeping's office, and at about 10:30 to 11, he told me to go and get a bit of sleep. So I went down to a hotel in Northumberland Avenue, and after about half an hour, I had a telephone call saying, proceed to the Admiralty as soon as you possibly can, join up with Lieutenant Commander Lewis, and you'll be required to go down to Shoebury Ness with him and deal with what is thought to be a German mine.
Ouvry's colleague, Lieutenant Commander Roger Lewis, takes up the story.
They were intending to drop the mines in Southend Roads, where there were a lot of merchant ships at anchor. These two landed on a mud flat, part of the inter-service artillery range manned by the Army at Shoebury Ness. So we had Army personnel available as working party, we had workshops available, we had transport available which could operate on the mud, we had photographers available, we had every single facility that we could possibly have. They couldn't have chosen a better spot so far as Great Britain was concerned.
With the soldiers in the rear illuminating their path by Aldis lamp, Lewis and Ouvry trudged across the low-tide mudflats to inspect a sinister cylindrical object partially embedded in the ooze. Ouvry, suspecting that this unknown weapon might be a magnetic influence mine, had insisted that the party leave behind all the metal objects they were carrying and remove the metal buttons on their uniforms. Having safely removed a hydrostatic valve, Ouvry was confronted with a smaller fitting he had never seen before. It was made of polished aluminium with a brass securing ring, on top of which was a small copper strip. Lewis pulled paper from his pocket and made a rubbing of this fitting. This would enable the Navy workshop ashore to make a demagnetized spanner capable of unscrewing the fitting. Morning, Ouvry, accompanied by an able seaman, resumed the dangerous work on the mine, observed at a safe distance by Lewis and a second able seaman. Ouvry later recalled that he felt no fear as he approached the mine, merely an absolute determination to get to grips with the mysterious aluminium fitting. The two men set to work. What they didn't know was that the copper strip on the fitting they were about to remove was a safety device, which the Germans should have removed before dropping the mine. This saved their lives. Ouvry used a metal rod to ease the fitting out.
I then got hold of it with my hand and very carefully lifted it up. I thought it might be a magnetic needle or some magnetic device, so I lifted it up very slowly so as not to move it quickly in the Earth's magnetic field. I thought that might be fatal. When I got it clear of the mine itself, I saw underneath a polished cup screwed into the bottom of this fitting, which was aluminium. And that I recognized as a gain or form of detonator.
The next step was to turn over the mine to examine the fittings underneath. The spring in the tail was to eject the parachute. Had the mine detonated, it would have vaporized Ouvry and the able seamen, leaving a crater at least 20 yards in diameter.
Brass rod.
Underneath the second fitting lay a screwed bung, topped by 2 blocks with terminals on them. Attached to the terminals were colored wires leading into the main body of the mine. Exercising the greatest care, Ouvry parted the wires by twisting and then insulated them. Now Ouvry had to remove what looked like a detonator with a non-magnetic screwdriver. The detonator came away quite easily. To reveal a German type known to Ouvry. The last item to be removed was the mine's priming charge, necessary to explode the main charge when the detonator itself was fired. Ouvry was on the last lap. The wires at the base of the priming charge were cut and insulated. The work of Ouvry and his colleague was over. The mine was taken ashore and loaded onto a truck. Its destination was a laboratory at HMS Vernon. Within 12 hours, a scientific team had unraveled the mine's secrets. A rear door, ringed with bolts, was opened. Inside was an aluminium dome set in a rubber diaphragm. Under the dome lay a scale inscribed with the word Gauss, a unit of magnetic measurement. The mine was magnetic. In the sea, water pressure forced rings of primer round a detonator to arm the main charge. With the detonator primed, it only required a passing ship to depress a needle, complete a circuit, and detonate the mine. The breakthrough had been made. King George VI travelled to Portsmouth to congratulate the men of HMS Vernon. He decorated Lewis and Ouvry with the DSO. The king then inspected the mine they had disarmed and a second magnetic mine which had fallen nearby and which had also been dismantled. Immediately after dismantling the mine, Ouvry and Lewis had been summoned to Whitehall to brief Churchill and senior naval officers on their achievement. The solid Lewis, known as Bull to his friends, and the ebullient Churchill did all the talking. Churchill told the meeting, "You have dissected this monster, divided it into pieces, and now you can examine it at leisure." But there was no time to be lost in finding a countermeasure. On the 4th of December 1939, the battleship Nelson was disabled by a mine at the Home Fleet anchorage in Loch Ewe. The incident was kept secret. The Admiralty now had to work fast. Its first task was to reduce what was known as a ship's magnetic signature. The lines here represent the Earth's magnetic field, which is strengthened by the presence of a large metal object like a ship. Measured in a unit called a milligauss, the field is increased by the passing ship and can be plotted as a curve known as the magnetic signature. The mine was set to go off at 50 milligauss, exploding directly under the ship. A way had to be found to degauss a ship by reducing the magnetic signature to a harmless level so that the mine's firing mechanism would not be activated. Experiments were conducted on the cruiser Manchester. They showed that a ship's signature could be reduced by hanging a coil of copper cable round the hull and then passing an electric current through it. The order went out to fit so-called degaussing coils to all warships. One of the first merchant ships to receive the same treatment was the liner Queen Elizabeth. She arrived in New York in March 1940 on her maiden voyage. When she docked, the degaussing coils were clearly visible. But such protection was not always effective, as Donald Henley, a degaussing officer, explains.
The chap had it's quite a small ship, had a degaussing coil on, and he came alongside the quay and switched off his degaussing coil and blew himself up. There was a mine nearby. In other words, he was quite safe while it was on, but when he switched off, his field increased by a power of about, a multiplication of about 5, which was enough to trigger the mine.
To gauge how much current to run through the degaussing coil, it was necessary to make precise measurements of the magnetic signatures of individual ships. Degaussing ranges were laid across the entrances to harbours. They consisted of detecting units, positioned on the seabed and linked to a station on shore. Ships entering or leaving the harbour sailed over the detectors. The ship's magnetic signature was recorded on shore and, if necessary, modified. The degaussing cables didn't need to be visible to the naked eye. They could be fitted inside the ship's hull. Nevertheless, the logistics of degaussing Britain's merchant fleet presented a huge challenge, particularly when it came to degaussing the myriad of smaller ships, trawlers, coasters, dredgers, and harbour tugs and ferries. These coastal vessels were treated by a process known as wiping. A current was passed through a horizontal cable wrapped round a ship's hull. The wiping process immunized a small ship against magnetic mines for anything up to 5 months. In the spring of 1940, the uneasy calm of the phony war was shattered. Denmark and Norway were invaded, then the Low Countries and France. The French army and its ally, the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, were swept aside. German tanks raced across the plains of northern France to the English Channel. 250,000 men of the BEF were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. The naval and merchant ships which picked them up had all been degaussed or wiped. The magnetic mines which might have played havoc with the evacuation were effectively neutralized. Victory of a kind had been snatched from the jaws of defeat. The men of the BEF lived to fight another day. The citizens of London prepared for German air attack, the preliminary to a cross-channel invasion. The Home Guard was mobilized. Britain stood alone. The magnetic mines remained a threat. A practical method of sweeping for them and destroying them had to be found. A number of methods were tried. Among them was the magnetic A sweep. This consisted of a wire strung between two ships from which were suspended 72-inch bar magnets. It was hoped that the magnets trailed over the mines would detonate them, but the deployment and operation of the system caused more problems for the crews than the mines below. The worst of the inherent flaws was that because the sweep was trailed just above the seabed, any magnetic mines it detonated would blow away the bars and the sweep would have to be repaired. There was also the problem that
when the magnets were together on board before putting overboard, they all stuck together. When you were sweeping, the magnets were supposed to be 6 feet from the bottom, and as the tide rose and fell, you had to take the sweep all together in, adjust the length of the pennants, and then put it out again. So that it was, from a seamanship point of view, a thoroughly nasty job of work, and we dubbed it the boatswain's nightmare.
Another method was the mine destructor ship, fitted with a huge electromagnet in its bows or hold, which was linked to a generator. Like the magnetic sweep, destructor ships were also at risk from mines exploding too close to them. The skid was another unsuccessful countermeasure, a lighter or barge on which a large diameter solenoid coil detonated the mines. The problem was that the skid was also destroyed in the explosion. An exotic countermeasure involved fitting huge and heavy external magnetized coils round a number of Wellington bombers. The system worked, but each converted bomber could clear only a narrow channel, and the Wellingtons were too cumbersome to fly in formation. Nevertheless, these airborne minesweepers performed valuable service clearing the Suez Canal of air-dropped German mines. The search continued for a fail-safe method of dealing with the magnetic mines. The answer was provided by the degaussing expert, Lieutenant Commander Charles Goodeve. Goodeve proposed that a demagnetized ship tow 2 different lengths of buoyant energized cable, the longer positive and the shorter negative. Electric current from the ship was passed through the sea between the cables to explode a magnetic mine below without damaging the ship. Goodeve dubbed his proposal the double L sweep.
The secret of the double L sweep was that the currents partly went through cables and partly went through the sea. You could control what went through the cables, but you couldn't control what went through the sea. It would do what it wanted itself. And that was the question, what would it do? So we had to determine that. Actually, Lord Charwell, who was the advisor to Winston Churchill, his scientific advisor, did some calculations and showed that the currents through the sea would go the wrong way and compensate everything that was being done in the cables.
The deployment of double L sweeps got underway in the spring of 1940. On minesweeping operations, the electrode of the long tail with its flag buoy was the first to be paid out over the stern from a massive drum. Speed through the water could not exceed 4 knots if the cables were to be kept under control. Fully paid out and connected to the positive and negative junctions in the ship's terminal box, the double L sweep was ready to go to work. In the final version, 2 ships were used, both pulsing currents simultaneously for 6 seconds at a time, enough to explode any mines. Each pulse cleared 10 acres of seabed, sweeping a channel 300 yards wide. Within a year, the double L sweep had ceased to be a novelty, and the menace of the magnetic mines was receding, although in December 1940, they still accounted for nearly 83,000 tons of shipping. Henceforth, U-boats were to present the greatest threat to Britain's shipping lanes. But in the early months of the war, the vital coastal lanes had been kept open by the men of the minesweepers. They had diagnosed the threat and devised the double L sweep which overcame it. The right men had been in the right place at the right time. But German mine warfare did not stand still. In the autumn of 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a bombing offensive against Britain's cities. It became known as the Blitz. Parachute-delivered mines intended to block the channels leading to major ports were carried by German bombers. Not all of them splashed down safely. Like the Shoebury-Ness mines, some were stranded on mudflats. One of them, recovered from the mouth of the River Ogmore in Wales, was dismantled by the experts at HMS Vernon. They discovered that it was sound activated by a microphone tuned to the frequency of a ship steaming at normal speed. The answer was the Congo hammer, a contraption housed in a drum towed beneath the ship. The hammer emitted a continuous sound and vibration, which could detonate the mine at a distance of up to a mile. It became a standard fitting for merchant vessels and many warships. The same effect was achieved by firing salvos of graded charges at regular intervals. In the autumn of 1940, the Germans found a new role for the magnetic mines countered by the double L loop. In the Blitz, Britain endured a strategic bombing campaign which lasted 8 months. Parachute-borne magnetic mines were dropped indiscriminately on Britain's cities. They caused heavy damage, but many of them failed to explode. They were dealt with by the men from HMS Vernon. During 1940, the British had braced themselves for a cross-channel invasion. 4 years later, along with their American allies, they were preparing their own cross-channel invasion, the preliminary to the liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe. This brought an unusual assignment for the MineHunters at HMS Vernon. Because the Allies couldn't count on capturing a harbour when they returned to Europe, they planned to build 2 artificial ones, codenamed Mulberries, off the Normandy beachhead, one in the British sector at Arromanches and the other in the American sector at Saint Laurent. The Mulberries, built in great secrecy, were towed across the Channel after the Allies had landed in June 1944. The Mulberries consisted of offshore and flanking breakwaters, constructed of large ferro-concrete caissons, towed into position, sunk, and supported by block ships. Inside these protected areas were floating piers, connected to the shore by floating roadways. The 70 block ships ranged from the 1911 French battleship Courbet to redundant Liberty ships and ancient freighters. Now it became the job of the men from HMS Vernon to sink rather than save ships. They devised a simple but effective system which ensured that the sunken block ships settled into their allotted positions in the Mulberry harbours. Courbet proved a particularly difficult nut to crack. In the end, she settled on the seabed in 10 minutes, sunk by 8 Amatol charges, each of which was tamped with a pile of up to 20 sandbags. All but one of the block ship's electrically triggered explosive charges detonated as planned. The misfire had been caused by rats, which had gnawed through the cable insulation. Secondary detonating fuses completed the job. The ships obediently settled on the bottom, with the exception of the anti-aircraft platform, Allenbach. She slewed out of line, but still provided a shelter for small craft. When the tide of war moved on, and the Mulberries were no longer needed, the block ships were raised and salvaged for scrap. Although their effectiveness was limited by storms at the end of June 1944, the Mulberries remain one of the most imaginative engineering achievements of World War II. The first barrier the Allies met when they landed in Normandy was the coastal defense system of the Atlantic Wall. In the months which preceded D-Day, the Atlantic Wall in Normandy had been massively strengthened by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B. It was Rommel's intention to halt the Allies on the landing beaches and throw them back into the sea. Minefields in the landing areas played an important part in Rommel's calculations. While work continued on the Atlantic Wall in anticipation of an Allied invasion in mid-May, Rommel was wondering what to do with a top-secret stock of pressure mines held in Germany and France. Orders to use them could come only from Adolf Hitler himself. On Hitler's orders, Rommel had deployed his pressure mines, but they were fitted with a self-flooding device to sink them at the end of May, a time by which Rommel expected to have defeated the Allied invasion force. The mines were now degrading on the muddy seabed. They were removed for repair in Germany. The first consignment arrived in the city of Magdeburg just 2 days before the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of northwest Europe. The defenses in the Normandy sector of the Atlantic Wall had been deprived of a weapon with the potential to wreak havoc on the Allied invasion force. It was not until 10 days after the D-Day landings that the mines could be laid at night by a handful of low-flying aircraft. By then, the Allied bridgehead had been established, and reinforcements were flowing across the Channel. Nevertheless, the pressure mines did have some effect. Few could be laid off the British beaches, Juno, Gold and Sword, since they were well protected by barrage balloons. But the American beaches, Omaha and Utah, had fewer. Here, German aircraft managed to drop a number of mines. Within a few days, they had sunk or badly damaged 30 vessels, including 4 destroyers. The Allies quickly recovered one of the pressure mines and were able to adopt countermeasures. They soon worked out the amount and rate of change in water pressure required to set off the mine. Ships' captains were advised of the optimum speeds at which to travel in mined areas, reducing the disturbance beneath their ships and simultaneously reducing the risk of activating the mines. The build-up in the Normandy beachhead gathered pace. But the war was not over for the mine experts of HMS Vernon. As the Allied lodgement in Normandy expanded, the problems posed by wrecked and heavily mined harbours multiplied. Cherbourg, for example, presented a scene of utter devastation, clogged with booby-trapped mines for the unwary. The garrisons of the Atlantic Wall were being marched into captivity. The threat posed by the pressure mines and the Devil's Gardens left behind by the Germans provided another task for HMS Vernon. Working alongside their American allies, the mine hunters brought life back to wrecked harbours across Europe. They had come a long way since the dark days of November 1939, when they had cracked the secrets of Germany's magnetic mine. The men from HMS Vernon had played a vital and unsung part in securing the Allied victory. Its importance was to be underlined by events on the other side of the world. For here, in the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, another great empire was dependent on its sea lanes for survival. And it was the failure of Japan to cope with American mines which played a critical part in its ultimate defeat. At an early stage in the Pacific War, the Americans had decided to use submarines as mine layers to attack Japan's sea lanes. The range at which this aspect of the war had initially to be fought was too great for aircraft and too dangerous for conventional mine layers, which were extremely vulnerable to air attack. The subs were supplied with 1,100-pound magnetic and acoustic mines, which were ejected through their torpedo tubes. Operations were launched by 6 submarines, which laid minefields in the Gulf of Siam, the Gulf of Tonkin, and the Bongo Soedo approaches to Japan's own inner sea. It was a low-key start to one of the crucial campaigns of the Pacific War. After the US Navy's decisive victory in the carrier battle of Midway in June 1942, the tide of war began inexorably to turn against Japan. As the Japanese garrisons were driven out of one Pacific stronghold after another, air bases were established on islands at progressively smaller flying distances from their targets. As these bases crept nearer to Japan's home islands, the submarines were no longer needed to mount marathon sorties into enemy-controlled waters. For the remainder of the war, mine laying was undertaken by aircraft. In November 1943, the US Marine Corps stormed ashore on the atoll of Tarawa in the Central Pacific. Tarawa lay on the extreme eastern edge of Japan's defensive perimeter. It was defended to the last man by 5,000 troops. The fighting on Tarawa was a bitter portent of things to come in the Pacific. The Japanese were now being driven into a crescent, stretching back from the Marshall Islands in the Central Pacific through New Guinea and the Moluccas to Sumatra and the coast of Burma. The Americans called this the Outer Zone, and from the island air bases they had acquired, they launched a mine-laying campaign which sank nearly 200 enemy ships and damaged over 150 more. The parachute-dropped influence mines they used, both magnetic and acoustic, contained powerful payloads of Torpex high explosive. The parachutes were only 6 feet in diameter, just big enough to prevent damage to the mine's delicate mechanism as it entered the water. Like the German magnetic mine of 1939, a pressure mechanism armed its American successor once it was in the water. Once primed, the mines were given a special mark. Before they were loaded onto the bombers, the arming mechanism's safety locks were replaced by soluble washers, which would dissolve once the mine was in the water. Next stop, the Pacific Ocean. In August 1944, B-29 superfortresses flew the longest mine-laying mission of the war. From their base in Ceylon, they made a 3,800-mile round trip to target areas in the Bangka Strait off the northeast coast of Sumatra. They dropped only a handful of mines, but the mission was a great psychological shock to the Japanese, who had not anticipated the threat posed by Allied mine laying. By mid-August 1944, the Americans had captured the important Japanese Central Pacific air bases in the Marianas chain. This gave the B-29s a springboard 1,500 miles south of Tokyo from which to step up the mining offensive against the Japanese home islands. The mine layers were placing a noose around the neck of the Japanese war economy. By March 1945, the continued Allied advance threatened to cut the Japanese off from their sources of raw materials in Southeast Asia. Mining was stepped up. From Guam and the Marianas, B-29s flew regular missions laying thousands of magnetic, acoustic, and pressure mines in the shipping lanes of the Japanese home islands. The aircraft generally operated on moonless nights, flying at 6,000 feet, and, when visibility was poor, using radar to pinpoint the mine-laying areas. The superfortresses were supplemented by other aircraft, including Catalina flying boats. With their low speed, the Catalinas flew at almost wave-top height to slip in under enemy radar. The American mine layers exerted a stranglehold on Japan's southern industrial ports. One ship was sunk or damaged for every 24 mines laid. Shipping losses to mines and submarines slashed the Japanese merchant fleet to a quarter of its 1944 strength. Its ships were now running a deadly gauntlet through the American minefields and submarine patrols. Life in mainland Japan began to grind to a halt. The population was reaching the point of starvation. With grim irony, this was the code name of the American mining operation. It took 2 atom bombs, dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to bring the Japanese to the surrender table on the 15th of August 1945. But Japan's defeat had already been secured by the firebombing of her cities and the relentless mining of her harbors and coastline. The mines left the Japanese with no way out. 5 years earlier, the British merchant fleet had weathered a similar crisis. The MineHunters had won their own private war to keep the shipping lanes open. Not only had they ensured survival, they had also paved the way for final victory.
Coming up on UK TV History, the second in a 2-part profile of Nelson Mandela, the living legend.